an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering The Traitor Queen, chapters 9, 10, and 11. Friends and enemies, no good choices, and a change of plan. In these chapters, Lorkin is unceremoniously released from prison after a pretty harrowing scene in which he has to decide whether or not to kill the woman who has been tortured. And I am dying of curiosity, because what did he choose, and why did they let him go? Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Ashleigh for commissioning this episode. So, all right, this is a really, loaded section with Lorkin, and I'm just going to talk about that first again, because it's the one, storyline that's interesting me the most at the moment. So, Lorkin's, wakes up, and he is in this cell, loses track of where he is for a second. And then he realizes that the woman is there. And for a second, I was kind of confused. I was like, what is she doing here? How did he fall asleep during this? Because I'm assuming she's still there because she's still being tortured. So there's just how? And it turns out they finished torturing her. And then they threw her into the cell with him. And it's one of those, I'm not really sure psychologically what it is that they're trying to do other than sort of break him down. But they put him in a position where he could heal her. And without really thinking about the consequences of it, he goes ahead and he heals her. And I'm thinking, of course, dude, you're giving them a clean slate to work with tomorrow. Why would you do that? But at the same time, when you're watching somebody who's had bones broken and is deeply suffering, how do you not do that if you have the capacity to do it? And apparently it didn't occur to Lorkin that this would just give them a new place to start. So he heals her. And the next day they're brought to the spot where the torture happens. I don't think that I quite realized last time that he was brought somewhere else. I thought that she was being tortured in front of the cell. And maybe that is what happened and they just sort of changed it up for this time around. But this dude, the torturer, does it again. Throws her into the cell with him again as well. And Lorkin is left having to make another choice. And he wants to heal her. It's his impulse. But when he moves toward her, she basically hisses at him to stay away from her because she's wised up to what the fuck happens. The first night when he healed her, she thanked him for it. And this time she's like, no, we are not playing this game again. Which, honestly, this is something that is in the Dresden Files. Those of you who read that, spoilers for, I think it's, I'm trying to remember which book it is. But Harry, in order to make a deal with Mab, he winds up having to kill the former Summer Knight. And it's sort of a mercy killing in its way, because the man had been tortured and then healed and bathed and fed and comforted, and then tortured again, and then healed and bathed and comforted over and over and over every day for 3 years. And admittedly, when Harry kills him, it's not really out of mercy. It's because he wants something. But it's one of those, like, it's such a horrifying prospect, the whole idea of being able to do that to somebody. And that's when it's somebody healing you who intends to torture you again, and that's why they're doing it. Lorkin is genuinely trying to heal her out of goodwill, out of a feeling of obligation to do the right thing. And there's something so much worse about that being perverted, you know? Like, it's him trying to do something good, and they manage to use that as a tool against him and a tool of torture. Now, I will say, I have this sort of, like, back and forth feeling regarding whether or not I want to know more details of what they did to her. At one point, he says she gestured with her unbroken arm. But other than that, and the fact that there's a lot of blood, we don't really know what was done. And I'm beginning to realize, I think, what this author is, what her issue is for me in these books. It's weird that I'm coming up against it now, because in former books, it doesn't seem like she quite has the same problem, but it's sort of all like heading into this one direction. So, and I don't want to say this with this, like, well, if she were a real writer, if she were good at this, she'd show the torture and tell us what happened. That's not necessarily true. But I'm realizing that this author is somebody who writes a little bit for, like, a wish fulfillment fantasy. And so I think that's why she has all of her characters being very rational, honorable people. And she even like, for example, something I was thinking about when I was reading today was the threat that we have seen of somebody who isn't trained with magic, like, exploding, right? They, like, die and they kill a bunch of people around them. And similarly, the death of a magician causes an explosion if there's, like, unspent power. And so they have, like, healers nearby whenever a magician is on their deathbed, so that that sort of impact doesn't happen. And that's all well and good in terms of, like, them making... They are preparing for the eventuality of that kind of problem. My issue is, you can't predict that all the time. And it's kind of bonkers, considering how early we learn that that's a potential fallout and that's something that can happen, that we are at this point 6 books in, and that's never been seen to happen. And what I realized when I was thinking about that is that this author doesn't like things to be untidy in terms of letting the plot go in certain directions simply because she wants to explore what would happen if such and such went on. She likes everything to fall within the lines of the story that she's decided, and whether or not it makes sense that has never happened and we never hear about it, that doesn't really factor in. And let's be honest, with the number of, like, natural magicians that pop up who aren't aware of what they do, and the fact that we have, like, Curalia, Imardine is just a small portion of Curalia. You would think you would hear about this from other places. You would think that somebody would, like, perhaps have an aneurysm in the middle of the night and die and it's not like, it's the kind of thing that I feel she brings up in order to create stakes and to create a reason why we need to really worry about this thing. But she doesn't want to actually deal with the messiness of what that would be like, and how that would damage people, how that would damage the guild. And I think that's sort of why we don't see, like, the hauling in the hurricane to help us get back to Sachaka faster. And we don't see the way that, like, basically, we don't see the way a lot of the magic works. I think because she just doesn't have that much interest in it. And it's like, feels a little unwieldy to her. And she likes to stick with things that make sense and just are kind of pieces of the puzzle that she's already decided she's putting together. And to me, that's a mistake. It's not like I don't understand wanting to stay on the path of the story that you're writing, but it's really kind of unfathomable to me to come up with ideas that interesting and then not pursue them. I would rather, as an author, that you not tell me about them if you're not going to do anything with them. Do you know what I mean? So anyway, this whole thing with Lorkin and this woman, it's just sort of got me thinking about how we need a woman to be tortured for what's going on with Lorkin and to know that he's like haunted by it. And she doesn't have interest in actually showing us what that is. And in most authors, if they chose to not tell us, I would see that as restraint. But in this author, I'm realizing it's more she doesn't like it and doesn't want to write it. And, I'm not trying to shit talk that, because personally I'm not somebody who I think would enjoy writing a torture scene, But it's sort of, I'm realizing, a really good example of the way that she seems to handle a lot of messy, I keep using that word, but that really is the best word I can think of, pieces of the plot, is she won't actually show us. She just talks about them afterward because she just doesn't seem to either know how to handle them or want to handle them. And it's, I think, limiting. And compared to the way that she was willing to really dig in the first trilogy, all I can think of this now is that she's gotten tired of writing these. That's how it feels to me, is that she's writing this trilogy in this universe here because the publishers wanted it and they gave her a really big advance and she decided to do it, but her heart wasn't in it and she didn't really care. And that's how I feel that coming through in the writing here. It just doesn't feel like she's particularly connected. And when I just kept asking myself at the end of the last book, why would you do it this way? It's just more and more, I'm like, because she doesn't really want to be writing this, I don't think. And I know that she writes other stories. I know that she writes, in a whole other universe and other things. So maybe she just, had moved on into another series. And I know that can happen with writers where the audience is demanding more of this particular universe that you created and more of these cast of characters, and you don't really want to do it, but you've got yourself a nice steady income, and so you kind of have to. And I wonder if that isn't what happened here, And it's a shame, because then nobody gets what they want. The author is writing something they're not particularly invested in, and the readers get a book in which it's very clear the author wasn't invested, and it's not fun to read. So I just feel kind of bad about it. I would love to talk to her and just be like, what exactly went on here? Because it just, this sort of stepping aside from setups of interesting ideas, it's what you would do for an outline. And then once you sit down to write, you pull that out and you're like, okay, time to write this intense scene. But she just didn't do that part. So it feels much more like sort of a ghostwritten thing, Anyway, I just wanted to mention that. And like I said, I'm not particularly sorry we don't see the torture or more of, but I do think it would help us as an audience to really know the extent of the damage. This woman is on the verge of death. And why? Is it because he cut her open? Is it purely blood loss? He says something about thinking that there are some ribs broken that maybe punctured some organs. So is it due to just being punched? I just, for the sake of the picture in my mind, I would kind of like a little bit more to know exactly the extent of her injuries and what he's looking at when he's trying to decide what to do, because that would sort of inform the way I interpret whatever he chooses to do. Does that make sense? More information helps put me in his shoes a little bit better. And I feel like that's key. You want to feel like you are also making the decision or not in either case, you know? So anyway, eventually she tells him to hand her the water, and he is looking at the water, realizing that when he received it, the traitors put a symbol on it that said that it wasn't safe. And he is like, oh, this would be a perfect excuse, actually, where I could let her poison herself. And it's up in the air whether she knows it's poisoned. I think she does, because she asks him to kill her. And then she asks for the water. And then she asks him to kill her again. I feel like if you are wanting to die, being thirsty isn't something you're worried about. I think she knows the water's poisoned. And he's sort of like, he's realizing, oh, I could give her this, and it wouldn't be seen as me killing her the way that it would were I to simply reach over and use black magic and pull the life out of her. But it would still be the same thing. I'd be handing this to her knowing it would kill her. It amounts to the same thing. It just provides me personally with a convenient excuse. And, I just don't, I'm not entirely sure what I think he's going to do there. I feel like the fact that he winds up out of prison, that they let him go, signals that there was a massive change of some kind. And the only change that I can think of is that he killed her. However, I don't know if that's like, perhaps giving her the water and her perhaps dying because it's poisoned, it felt like he sort of would have been able to prove that they were actually trying to harm him, because they've been hiding behind this veil of like, well, we're going to torture her because we can't directly hurt you. You're off the table. But if he gives her water intended for him and that poisons her, that proves he wasn't off the table and they weren't going to, you know, be honorable in the way they were treating him. And that gives him a little bit of an upper hand. That remains to be seen, though. Like, I think the right thing to do is give her the water. But he also does point out that in allowing this woman to die, he's essentially just telling them to go get another person to torture. And does healing her and letting it all rest on this one woman, preventing it from being multiple victims, is that better? And personally, I think whether they choose to go get another person is not your responsibility. That is on them. Your responsibility is the person in front of you that you have the ability to help. You have no power over what they choose to do after she dies, but you do have the power to put her personally out of her misery. And that's all you get to think about. Whether or not this adds up to other people later isn't on you. So personally, you know, if they were beating her to the point where she could die and she dies, that is something that is part of their equation that they, as torturers, hold total responsibility for. And Lorkin doesn't have any part of that part of it, you know? And I hope that he gave her the water. I am really curious, because him turning up, that was like a real surprise, that he just winds up showing up at the fucking guild house, released with no warning. There's no apparent, like, there's a message from the king that says he's not allowed to leave. But other than that, there is no message to, like, explaining what happened. And I really like, too, because we're in Daniel's perspective when we find out Lorkin's been released. Daniel and Tyen are looking at Lorkin, and they can both see something happened to him. It's really clear to both of them that, like, oh God, what did they do? Because there's no marks on him. It's obvious that he hasn't been harmed physically, but there's an air to him that clearly indicates that he has gone through some trauma. And none of them asks. They're all sort of too preoccupied with the relief of him being delivered back safe, which they really weren't sure was going to happen, and are trying to give him some space, I suspect, because they're just, they know that it's just really bad. But I'm hoping that he will talk to one of them, or perhaps to Sania, as she's on her way there. And I liked a lot how surprised I was by Lorkin's release. These books have not held many surprises. For the most part, I have kind of like, it's been going along in a way that I kind of was like, yeah, all right, well, that seems like the next logical step to take things. And him just being let out after that scene wasn't anything that I expected. So I really appreciated that. So, all right, let's back it up. And we are going to, let's see, who is, here we go, Lillia. Lillia is still trying to get, like, supplies to her friends. And there's some talk about the passages under the guild that had been used during the Echani invasion. And they had been sealed off. And Lillia, along with other people, as it turns out, all sort of suspected that the guild had just said that they were sealed and left some of them open for their own purposes. But Anya goes and explores all of them, and it really seems like they're telling the truth that every single passage has been bricked up. So that's what Anya's been working on, is creating an entrance in one area, like taking down the brick and everything. So let's see. When it was time, beyond one of the inner passages, beyond the door was the hidden passage into the university. When it was time to leave her friend, she'd used the door and then made her way back to Sania's rooms. Now she was heading back to the hidden door, hoping it was too early for other novices to be in the inner passages. And Lillia is walking back to her rooms, and let's see, the new route into the passages would be much faster since she didn't have an awkward climb up to Sania's rooms, and when she returned, she would be closer to her first class of the day, which is honestly very beneficial. So sorry, she's not heading back to her room. She's heading to this passage. And as she's heading there, she hears somebody call out to her. At first she hears footsteps. She's trying to, like, outpace them, and it's clear they're speeding up to follow her. And then they yell, "Hey, Lillia, where are you going?" And she realizes that it's Bakken, the kid that tried to bully her. And, I was hopeful that when she took him down so very well in front of everybody that one time, that would be the end of it. I kind of suspected it wouldn't, because when you provoke somebody who has that kind of pride, it doesn't end usually. They feel the need to defend their honor, so to speak, and regain their pride by making an example out of you. I was so hopeful, though, because it really was such a baller move, the way that she was just, like, completely in his face. And it's really funny how Lillia is thinking to herself, how stupid can this boy get? He doesn't know how strong or weak I am. He doesn't even have any friends with him to gang up on me. If he's hoping I'm up to something that he could turn me in for, he shouldn't have called out to me before he found out what it was. And I'm like, look, all that's true, Lillia, granted. However, it doesn't seem to have occurred to her that she doesn't know how strong he is. And I feel if he's coming at her by himself in dark places, and he says what he says next, which is, You've got big ideas about yourself. Think you're better than anyone because you know black magic. It's the other way around, you know. You're the lowest scum of the guild and everyone hates you. That's why you've got no friends. Everyone knows Naki's death was your fault. And she gets really mad and then immediately quells it because she's like trying to keep him from seeing that his words got to her at all, which is smart. And she says, glad you got that off your chest. And he says, yes, but I'm not done with you. I want you to apologize. No, I want you to beg me. And they get interrupted by Jonna. A dude who's coming at you alone in a corridor and starts to say, I want you to beg me. That feels like somebody who has a secret weapon up their sleeve. That feels like somebody who knows they have the upper hand and maybe you don't. And I'm just saying, I want Lillia to be more careful than she is here. Lillia is just so ready to be like, oh, this fucking guy. And honestly, part of me respects that. Part of me does. But, girl, calling him stupid because he doesn't know what he's dealing with when you also don't know what you're dealing with is a little bit lacking in self-awareness, and maybe you should just rein that shit in a tiny bit. So, Jonna interrupting was great. I was so glad because I did not want to see this because, you know, we've been put through it already with Regin and Sania. I just kind of didn't want to do it again. I have no doubt it'll come back around, but for right now, I'm good. And when we have the scene later with Jonna, I got kind of what I had been saying I wish was in the last book, which was Jonna becoming more of a full character. You know, it's not like she's got a whole point of view or anything, but I liked knowing that she is going to be given a little bit more to do. And I really like the fact that Anya eventually, trusts her and decides to confess to her what's going on. And I love this moment where she finds out that Sania was bullied by Lord Regin, because Jonna, she is telling her that Sania dealt with bullying, and immediately she says, who would do that? Who is stupid enough to pick on Sania? And then when Jonna tells her Lord Regin, she's just kind of like, wait, he's not dumb. And Jonna's like, no, that's not necessarily how that works. And this is when Jonna's like, so why do you have that lamp oil in your bag? And she's like, what do you mean? I don't what? And finally just tells her everything. So she says, why come here? And she says, we opened one of the old entrances. Jonna frowned and shook her head. Now that's too dangerous. And I don't mean being below. I mean up here. Someone will see you. You must only use the passage in Sania's rooms. We shall have to do something about how dirty you get, like give you alternative clothing. In the meantime, I'm taking the bottle and you're going straight to class. Tonight, we will discuss more effective strategies for dealing with our guests. And I love that later on, when Lillia tells Sari about the fact that Jonna knows, she's super apologetic, and Sari has to be like, girl, it's okay. Telling her is not such a big deal. I like Jonna. She knows me. She didn't really like me, but you know, she'll deal. It'll be fine. So and then we go to Daniel's perspective, and I don't think that Lorkin comes back in this scene. Daniel here is just writing out his notes again, and he's realizing that he's running out of ink. And there comes a scene a little bit later when him and Tayend are talking about the fact that he doesn't have any and he has asked for more. And they begin to put together that they think the powers that be are trying to keep them from getting the supplies they would need to communicate at all. Because basically, Daniel is realizing that the notes that he has on the information that he collected from the Duna are in danger of never actually being read by the guild. And so he's trying to transcribe everything into and make a copy of it and sort of code it so that if it's found, they won't be able to get the real information about the like stones and being able to control mind reading using them. But he wants somebody to like be able to sort of figure it out. And I'm trying to find this part where he says this. He would make substantial additions to his history of magic once he returned to Curalia. He had decided to make an extra copy to be stored in a safe place somewhere outside the guild house, so that if this building was attacked, his work wouldn't be lost. Ideally, it should go to the guild, but he couldn't be sure it would arrive there. No doubt King Amakira had people in place to intercept and examine anything leaving and arriving at the guild house. In case his work was read by Sachakans, Daniel had been careful to leave out any mention of gemstones with magical properties, apart from the famous store stone that had created the wastelands. He'd had to come up with a way to hide references to them when writing out his notes, so that he wouldn't be betraying the Duna's trust. The stones were now people, powerful magicians referred to by their title. Daniel would have to change all mentions of these fictional characters back to gemstones when he came to write his book. And he says, if I die and somebody finds the new version, I'm going to be the perpetrator of some very big lies in our history. Y'all, I love this concept that, I mean, even today, that there could be like stories that we have taken to be about people. And it turns out that they were true stories, but somebody coded it all and made those like these objects into people that we think are real. And it turns out that they were just like, you know, some sort of like magical talisman or, you know, who knows what. And they were trying to keep information secret by using it that way. That is the concept of it being this massive shift in history. If he dies and nobody reads the new one, is sort of like sadly hilarious. I find it just, oof. I mean, part of me doesn't want that to happen because he put so much work into all this. Part of me does just because I want to see what that looks like. What would happen, you know? Ashleigh's here finally. Hi, Ashleigh, and Doom is here. I'm sorry, Doom, I didn't even see you. So here comes Ashaki Achati. And he and Daniel, they have a pretty, like, cold interaction here. Ashaki Achati is trying to be like, look, I know that things aren't great, but I really want to be friends still. And he says, I have no intention of trying to convince you to tell Lorkin to speak. I'm trying to rescue what remains of our friendship, even if it means pretending none of this unfortunate business is happening. And Daniel's like, yeah, no, you can't just like pretend this isn't happening. It's happening. And it's happening to somebody I care about. And pretend that like you are in my shoes and somebody you care. Like, what? Are you just going to set that aside? And Achati says something about how you are asking for more trust from us than we can give because we're really not allies. And Daniel's like, okay, if you want trust, you have to earn that trust. You have to, like, if we're going to become allies, you are going to need to figure that out. And I loved this exchange. Achati's like, well, don't you have to return that trust in us in order for it to grow? And Daniel's like, do you not realize that within my lifetime, y'all have attacked us? That's not ancient history. That's 20 years ago. There is no reason for you to, like, for us to trust you, and for you to come in here and act as if we owe it to you is some balls, man. Seriously. That is really bold. You are the ones that should be asking forgiveness, and y'all ain't doing it. So where does that leave us? This shouldn't be a surprise. And I was like, yo, he right though. That makes sense. Like, I really liked that was brought up specifically because I kind of am forgetting that the Sachakans were like, should be seen as being on the back foot. And they aren't acting like they are. And it's fooled me into thinking that they're not. And then I'm reminded of this and I'm like, oh, right. Y'all are really, you are acting like this is a situation that's very different than what it actually is. Ashleigh in the chat says, it almost feels like a much higher stakes version of 12-year-old Ashleigh asking her mom to treat her like an adult. Like there are some very valid reasons that is not happening. That's a good analogy. I like that actually. So he says, I hoped we could talk as friends, but instead we speak as if we are nations. I can at least assure you that Lorkin is fine. The king won't dare to harm him. Don't stop trying to see him, though. Goodbye for now. And this is when Tyen pops out and it's just like, bullshit. He is not trying to be your friend only for the sake of being friends. And Daniel's like, I mean, trust wasn't really the thing between us in the first place. And Tyen's like, oh, so it's just about that you like him. Okay. And Daniel just says, I don't know. I haven't made up my mind. And I'm like, Daniel, can you, like, look, the guy is attractive. He's clearly smart. But honestly, dude, I don't feel it like that. I don't know if it's the way it's written or if we're not supposed to, but there's not enough of a draw to this guy for me to care at all that Daniel is still a little bit interested. Daniel, get the fuck over it. The dude is part of a bad system. Just stop. Just don't. No, I'm not here for it. And this is when Tyen says, I was worried about you, but you're still your old self underneath. And Daniel says, underneath what? And Tyen gestures to him and just says, all that. And Daniel's like, this is not helpful. What does that mean? And Tyen's just like, you know what? Nothing. Never mind. And I'm like, no, tell though. Because clearly Tyen sees something going on with Daniel that I don't. And I don't know if this is linked to like, because I've said already how I felt that Daniel was sort of less fun than he used to be. Like when we first met him, he's just much more jocular and lighthearted and interested in an adventure in a way that it feels very muted now. Like he's interested in an adventure, but it feels much more intellectual and academic than for the sake of the adventure. And he doesn't really feel fun anymore. There's very little humor in him. It seems to me, he seems really different than he did. And I'm wondering if that's what Tyen is referring to, or if there's something else that I'm not getting as a reader, you know? So this is when he mentions that he ran out of ink, and Tyen says, they put the last of the house's supplies in my ink pot last night. I sent probably a slave off to buy more this morning, but he came back empty-handed. Someone took it off him. He claimed he didn't know who it was in the way that people do when they're lying and they want you to know it. So, yeah, this is probably them trying to control them, making notes and sending correspondence and whatever. And Tyen is basically like, if you're going to keep working on them, you are going to want to lock them up with magic so that the slaves can't just like read them when you're out of the room. And he does decide to do that. So then we get the scene about with Lorkin trying to figure out how to handle this woman who's asking him to kill her. And I pretty much just talked about all of that already at the top of the thing. So I'm going to move right on to what's going on with Lillia. There's this moment that's pretty funny where Sari says that he was like going and visiting Sania for like 20 years. And everybody thinks that maybe they had like a romantic thing going on. And we know that Sari had been in love with Sania. But it's kind of amazing, usually, when an author establishes something like that, they carry it on forever. You know, the person who is like had a crush never really lets it go. And I had completely forgotten that Sari was into Sania. It's so ancient history now that I had like completely. So, and there's this moment where Lillia apologizes for suggesting that he was unfaithful, and Gull, like, kind of, it says Gull chuckled in a knowing way. And I was like, ooh, so that sounds like he was unfaithful, but it wasn't necessarily related to that. And I was like, okay. So here's the point where Sari is like, all right, look, we are going to have to do something because we can't just stay here forever. And Skellen, I don't think, is going to buy that we're dead. I know that everybody out there is talking like we are, which is what we wanted, granted. But the dude isn't going to believe it unless he sees a body, and we can't provide that. So we are going to have to figure out another way to handle him. And essentially is like, I'm going to be bait. He is going to come to us because he knows that I'm here, and we're going to catch him that way. And it's one of those that is like pretty obvious that it was going to have to come to this, but everybody's very resistant to it anyway. And Callan is going to be involved in it. So they think. It turns out that Callan has this whole other thing that he's setting up, which we don't know anything about, and I don't trust at all. I'm extremely concerned about Callan in general. I don't know him, and I don't get his deal. He's sort of an odd inclusion in the story because he is, I feel like I'm supposed to be suspicious of him, but he's also so like lacking in personality that it's hard for me to like develop any real feelings about whether I'm actually suspicious of him or whether it's just circumstantial because of his place in the story that I'm suspicious of him, you know? He seems to be behaving like an upstanding citizen when he's in conversation with Lillia later, and he's like, all right, well, I get why he'd want to do that, but we're not going to do it yet. There's like, what he's saying makes sense in the moment. But then when I think about it later, I'm like, well, he's just putting them off. And I don't know if I trust that. It's just like, I don't know. He doesn't feel distinct enough to me to have developed a sense either way of what his deal is. So yeah, he says, it's a bit, I plan to involve Callan because it's a bit much to ask Lillia to shoulder all the burden of magical protection or confront two rogue musicians, if Skellen brings his mother along. So at this point, like, Anya is like, you know, when she first hears that they're setting a trap, she's like all about it. But when she realizes that Sari's going to be using himself as bait, she gets very agitated. And when she says, I don't like it, and he asks why, she gets really weird and grabs the table lamp and leaves the room. And finally, Lillia goes and follows her, and Sari's left there sort of thinking about how Anya hated him for quite a while. And now it's pretty clear that she's worried about him and doesn't want to do this because she feels like it's going to put him in danger. And he's really sort of touched at the fact that their relationship has come along further than he had ever thought it would, because now she's actively worried about him. And I really liked that. I thought that was like a sweet little thing, because when she just gets up and leaves and doesn't want to say anything, I was kind of like, because you're worried about, why are you being weird and not wanting to say it? And then when we go into Sari's perspective and find out that she's always like, they've had a very tumultuous relationship, because we haven't really seen that, you know? We have heard about it, but it didn't make an impression on me, and I forgot. So I thought that was kind of nice, that she's like, not only does she care about him, but she feels real weird about the fact that this change has happened with her and doesn't want to say how she's feeling to him. So, okay, we go to, Anya and Lillia, where Lillia basically is just like, I really understand your hesitation here, but I also do think it's the smart move. And I would like for all of this to just be over because I miss you. And she starts to say, I know that that's like really selfish, but and as she's saying this, Anya grabs her and kisses her and says that she misses her too. And they just hold each other. And let's see. As Lillia took her hand, Anya hauled her to her feet, but in the same movement, she pulled Lillia close and kissed her again. This time it was a lingering kiss, as if she had forgotten her last words. A footfall, followed by a sharply indrawn breath, jolted Lillia back to her surroundings. She and Anya sprang apart and whirled towards the door, Anya bracing in a fighting stance. Lillia had drawn magic and formed a shield before she saw that it was only Sari standing in the doorway. His face was frozen in surprise. And he says, "Didn't mean to interrupt. Come back when you're ready," and then sort of smiles and runs off. And it turns out, because, I had meant to bring this up, I think last week, because he says something about how, he was glad that Anya had a friend. And all of a sudden I was like, a friend? Oh, Sari doesn't know. Does he? It didn't even occur to me that he didn't know until I heard the way that he was thinking about Lillia. And then I was like, oh my God, these two. I assumed Sari would be just cool with it and it wouldn't be a big deal. And the fact that it turned out he didn't know, I was like, well, if he doesn't, that means that they're kind of hiding it in front of him. And that would make sense that Lillia would do that because she's much less comfortable. But Anya doing that did surprise me a little bit. And she tells Lillia here that she had been trying to figure out how she was going to tell him. And now she doesn't have to worry about it. And she's kind of awkward, but at the same time, a little bit glad that it's over and done with. And there's also some talk about the fact that he's married, but he never officially got married and never officially got divorced because you need decrees from the king in order to do that. And nobody in the, none of the Lowies have the money or the standing to bother with that type of shit. So the marriages that they have aren't really official. And that makes me wonder if maybe Lillia and Anya can be married because it's not super official. So we have the scene where Lorkin comes home, shocking. And then we have Sania. This is so funny. Her and Regin pull up to the front of the Fergan's Rest Stay House. And when she hears Regin laughing, and I was a little bit surprised that Regin laughed because I thought, as somebody who had used to bully Sania, maybe he'd be a little bit more sensitive to the fact that Fergan had bullied her also. But then I found out he wasn't aware of what Fergan did. He thinks Sania is only behaving this way because Fergan's basically a notorious coward at this point in history. He fucking ran, and it's just, he is not in high standing. So the fact that this place is named after him is a little ridiculous. But when she tells him about how Fergan kidnapped her friend and tried to blackmail her and stuff, it doesn't seem like Regin knew about that. And there's this moment, I'm trying to find the spot. Let's see. Yeah, she says, that's right. He wanted you dishonored and thrown out of the guild. Oh, so he didn't know. He just forgot. It's not that he didn't know. He wanted you dishonored and thrown out of the guild to ensure no lower class people would join the guild again. And Sania says, yes, he'd be horrified if he were alive today at the changes in the guild. And Regin says, you never know. He may have changed his mind after the invasion. Lots of people did, And when she looks at him, there's this look of expectation, and she thinks that he's waiting for her to say something, acknowledge something with him. And I really wanted her to just be well, good for them, and then move right the fuck along. But she doesn't really get a chance to produce any actual response to that because Osen uses his blood ring to contact her at this point and completely distracts her. And this is when she finds out that Lorkin has been let go, but they're going to continue on with their plans as they had decided, even though Lorkin's been let out. And when they get there, I should mention too, there's a wedding happening. And the guy who is hosting them is like, there's sort of a weird moment. He recognizes her robes and seems to realize who she is and gets really like weird and anxious about it. And Sania is like trying to be as nice as possible. It's probably partially because she just is nice, and partially because she just wants to like set him at his ease. And she asks if they're going to be staying there, and he says that they're going off to their new home, but she's figuring that a lot of guests are going to be staying. So she's like, we'll just have one room then, because she's trying not to take up too much space. She's trying to make it as easy on this guy as possible, which is very considerate. Be nice to service people, everybody. That's all I'm saying. And it says he paused at several doors, wringing his hands, then with obvious reluctance led them to a room at the end of the corridor. As he opened the door, Sania was pleased to see it was a rather plain room with a single one-person bed, but no signs of current occupants. She had been worried that he'd throw guests out of one of their rooms, or that none of the rooms were empty. Stay houses along major routes were paid by the guild to keep one room free at all times, and everyone expected it would be their best room, but it must be tempting to put guests in there on busy nights, especially on lesser-used routes like this one. So I am assuming that he's like considering giving them a different room, and then finally decides to give her the best one after all. It was hard for me to interpret what that like anxiety that he was displaying was supposed to mean. But they get some dinner and wine, and the wine is pretty expensive good stuff that she realizes was probably set aside for the guild specifically for visitors. Which really, I mean, I just want to talk real quick about that kind of VIP treatment. They are spoiled rotten. They really are, the guild. You know, they really, And granted, like, they've put these things in place for themselves, so it's not like they're demanding something exactly for nothing. But expecting them to hold a room empty every night for nothing, that is, you know, that's like a loss. That's a lot. So she tells one of the serving girls to give a bottle of this wine to the bride and groom as a wedding gift. And Regin follows the serving girl out. And when he comes back, Sania gives him a look like, what was that? And he says, oh, I just wanted to make sure that they got their present, because that would be a real great moment for that maid to go and get another bottle and tuck it in her purse. And when everybody was like, oh, there's one less bottle than there should be, she could be like, well, it was a gift to someone. So yeah, that, I like that moment though. I always like it in stories when characters decide to be overly generous just for the hell of it. I am just so that way if I can be that way. You know, if I'm in a position financially where I can help somebody, I absolutely try as hard as I can to spread that shit around, which is part of why I stay poor, you know, but that's fine. But it is one of those things that a lot of people are able to accumulate wealth because they are not generous and don't help other people. And I don't want to accumulate wealth at the expense of the people around me. I can't enjoy having wealth when my friends and family are not doing okay. So it's nice to see a character and an author include that for like no particular reason, just, you know, to remind us that she's a good person. And maybe it'll be significant later. I don't know. But at the moment, I feel like it's just for the sake of it, and that's fine. So, yeah, she gets the message about Lorkin. There's this moment here where Regin's like, was it Lorkin or Osen that just contacted you? And she's like, how did you know Lorkin had one of my blood rings? And he sort of snorts and is like, I don't think for a moment that you would let him go off to Sachaka by himself. Well, kind of without a blood ring. Like, you're a mother. Get out of here. Of course you did. You gave him one. So at this point, she says Osen's orders were to continue with our plans. And when he says all of them, she's like, yeah. And he says, you said plans. We only have one official reason to be going to Sachaka. And she says, with multiple possible outcomes to deal with, are you going to keep looking for secret motivations in everything I say for this entire trip? To which Regin is like, yes. And honestly, I respected that he's like, yeah, probably. I mean, yes, that's kind of how I work. It's how a lot of other people work. And I absolutely want to make sure that I'm on my guard and anticipating what the fuck could happen to us. So, here we go. Oh yeah. Then when they are heading to bed, he's like, she says something like, I really hope you don't snore. And he's like, I might, I don't know. And when they fall asleep, the sound of somebody sleeping near her is sort of soothing, and she really is sort of comforted by it. And I liked that. There's like these little reminders dotted here and there about how Sania lives alone, and it's not like she's been so lonely or anything. It's not like it's constantly this burden to her that she doesn't have anybody. But it's a sort of like odd sensation for her to realize that having somebody in her life is kind of nice. And it's not like she's rejecting it because she prefers solitude exactly. It just hasn't really worked out. So let's see. I'm trying to find the moment. We have Lillia coming back into the rooms and talking to Jonna. And they have some clothing that they have set aside so that she can climb in and out of this like entryway and she doesn't screw up her robes. And Jonna is like kind of concerned about Lillia and keeping track of her comings and goings. And Lillia behaves as if this is really like, okay, Mom, but secretly is a little bit pleased at the fact that Jonna is worried about her and that there's somebody like watching out for her, which it is a nice feeling, especially when you haven't felt that for a while. Lillia's been on her own in the guild and there really hasn't been anybody watching her back since Sania left. And when you're old enough that people are beginning to trust that you can take care of yourself, you begin to realize how you took it for granted that somebody was like watching out for you. And so it's always nice to realize that somebody still is, And this is when she goes and sees Callan and tells him about what Sari wants to do. And Callan's basically like, that's a good idea and it's very brave of him, but I don't think we're going to go with that right now because we have a whole other plan that we've got working. And when she asks how long it could take, he says it might be weeks or months. And she thinks that he's just sort of offhandedly being like, well, who knows? But then she sees that he genuinely looks worried and feels a little bit better about it. And she's like, do you think Sari's going to be okay for that whole time? And that, again, maybe like, I don't know what to think of this guy. I thought he was being offhand too. And then it seems like he gives a shit. And that is the end of that chapter. So I am going to wrap up. But thank you very much, Ashleigh, for commissioning this episode. I'm really liking this book a lot more. And fingers crossed it continues. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.